fulfillment. And in a sense, you can all guess what I would talk about if this were in a theological lecture hall. We present our faith as the fulfillment of whatever people have had before the faith arrived, before orthodoxy came. It's important that we translate the Gospel of Matthew, for example. And for that matter, the Holy Fathers put the Gospel of Matthew first, even though it wasn't written chronologically first. Mark was written earlier. So why isn't Mark the first Gospel in the New Testament? Because the Gospel of Matthew is the one that refers to the Old Testament the most. It's the Gospel of Matthew that says over and over again, this was done that it might be fulfilled. And then he quotes the Old Testament prophecy. When St. Innocent came to Alaska, he therefore also began with the Gospel of Matthew, because Orthodoxy came as the fulfillment of what the people already had. Christ doesn't just come to fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament of the Jewish tradition. He comes to fulfill the religious intuition and longings of all mankind. He comes to fulfill all that's best in every culture, not just in the Hebraic. So while it's the link is most explicit there, he's a Jew fulfilling the Jewish prophecies, he also comes to the Greeks to fulfill all that's best in Hellenic culture, and he comes to Russia to fulfill all that's best in Slavic culture, and he comes to Alaska to fulfill all that is good and true and beautiful in Eskimo and Aleut and Indian culture. That part is self-evident. I don't have to talk to you about that. There's another sense of fulfillment, though, that might not occur to those who haven't labored in a missionary context. And that is when the seed comes into the soil, it produces a harvest, which is also a form of fulfillment. The missionary brings the gospel as he understands it, and by implanting it, by nurturing it in this new soil, the missionary learns something about the gospel the missionary didn't notice before. The soil produces fulfillment in this sense as well. For example, we in the Orthodox tradition name our children at baptism with the names of saints, because the names are something sacred. We are giving this child a sacred identity and also identifying them, linking them with a sacred ancestor. It's part of this interdependence, this all-togetherness, which is salvation. We get connected to people in other times and places who have already run the race and completed it successfully. We get a holy name when we are named in the church. Now, the Orthodox missionaries brought that to Alaska. And then they found out that this sense of naming already existed there. I found out about this quite by accident in a way. I'm in an Eskimo home where a newborn baby is in the cradle. And in comes an 80-year-old elderly woman walking with her cane. And she walks up to the cradle and says in her language, "And how's my husband today?" At first I thought Granny had flipped. What is she talking about? Here's a 4-day-old baby girl. And the woman comes into the house and says, "How's my husband?" And then you find out the parents of this baby, not biologically related to this widow, have given their child the Eskimo name of this widow's husband. Now, why did they do that? To establish a relationship which otherwise wouldn't exist. This family's not related to that widow, but her husband was a very respected Christian in the community, maybe the lead bass in the parish choir for the last 60 years. And he died 2 months ago, and this is one of the first children born since his death. Not only this baby girl, but 4 or 5 other babies, the next 3 or 4 born in this village and in neighboring villages, will all get this widow's husband's name. And they will consider themselves from now on related. And the widow will consider these children to be related. Hence, the baby girl is now my husband. The 60-year-old children of this 80-year-old woman come to visit with presents and they say, "These are for Dad." That summer, the baby's parents go fishing and fill their canoe, their boat, with salmon, maybe 100 pounds of king salmon. And they deliver it to the widow, and they say, "Your husband brings you these." I tell school teachers going out to the Alaskan bush, if you're tempted to ask of one child how he or she is related to another one, don't ask. The whole community is an invisible network of such relationships, where whether we're biologically related or not, everybody is related to everybody else. And everyone is committed to the well-being of everybody else. Long before Social Security and old age pensions and longevity bonuses were invented, Native people had ways of taking care of widows and orphans. And it's, in a sense, made somehow concrete by this tradition of naming your children after not relatives in your own family, but relatives in somebody else's, in order that they can be related to you. This is the form of building up community, tying people together in mutual support and harmony and cooperation, love, that we don't have in our culture. What a wonderful thing if we did something similar and named our children after the relatives of others so that we could be connected with them. The Orthodox missionaries came with their concept of name, and there already was one there. And now it's doubled. What name does this child get? Well, if the deceased great-grandfather was named Vasily, there's suddenly 5 new Vasilis in town. And the girls become Vasilisas. And they know, these children, who they're named after, because it's a way the community perpetuates the very best in their ancestors. What do I mean? For example, an elderly woman has died. Our names don't have genders. So you can name little girls after men because there's no such things as boys' names and girls' names in any Alaskan culture. So an elderly woman dies, and she was a seamstress. Several little girls will be named after her, and the first ones who show any inclination toward embroidery or sewing will be congratulated. And the family will say, "Boy, we gave her the right name. She's just like her namesake." In this way, the very best talents and interests of the previous generation are reintroduced in the youngest generation. There's someone else in the community who not only has that name, but continues the positive habits and behaviors of their namesake. But that's what we expect when we name our children after saints. It's the same kind of thing, only living in a mission field like Alaska, we come to appreciate what was always there, the importance of the name in a new way. There's another thing about relationships I've learned, living among Native Alaskans. I don't know how to explain this, but I have a story to tell about how I learned it. When I first arrived, my very first day in my wife's village, I was taken to a house where we were given a kind of berry dish. It's called Eskimo ice cream, but it's not made with cream. It's made actually nowadays mostly with mashed potatoes. Mashed potatoes whipped very vigorously with berries and sugar thrown in, so it comes out something like a Cool Whip salad. It's called agudak, which is from the verb to whip. Well, I had never had a agudak. It was my introduction to Eskimo culture, and they sat me at the table with 4 or 5 other students from the high school where I taught in Southeast, and they served agudak, and everybody else began devouring their agudak very enthusiastically. Well, I hadn't seen this particular food before, but I was willing to try, so with all these berries in this whipped, frothy, I didn't know what, I began too, but I noticed that I was the only one at the table eating it with a spoon. Everyone else was eating it the traditional way, which is exactly like we make the sign of the cross, 2 fingers and the thumb. I put my spoon down momentarily and said, "How come I have a spoon and none of the rest of you?" They said quite simply, because you're a kasak, meaning a white man. To which I responded, kasaunrito, I'm not. Yupiarunga, I'm a real person. And I put my spoon down and rather clumsily consumed the rest of my agudak with my fingers, to which my hosts responded with some giggles and delight. And I promised myself silently, mentally, never eat agudak with a spoon. 2 months later, I was in another village. They were having the Regional Orthodox Conference, the same one that Bishop Kallistos recently attended on the Kuskokwim River early last month. And we didn't have any important guests from outside the country. In fact, there was no bishop in Alaska that summer. But just to make sure that the people there didn't feel completely abandoned and neglected, they sent one Aleut priest from the Pribilof Islands to attend this conference as representative of the diocesan administration, Father Paul Merkuliev. And at that conference, just as at the end of this, we had a banquet. And at the banquet, a gudak. I was seated at the head table. Kind of at the end, because I was only a second-year seminarian. Father Paul, the guest of honor, the only non-Yupik among 500 guests, was seated in the center of the head table. And the aguda came at the end as a kind of dessert. Well, I took what I wanted and put it in my bowl and began eating the right way, of course, with my fingers. And then suddenly from under the table came a swift kick in my shin. The 65-year-old Yupik priest next to me said, "Michael, use your spoon." I said, "Kasaunrito, Yupiarunga. I'm not a white man, I'm a real person." He said, "I know." But pointing up the table, he said, "But we have company." And I looked around that banquet hall, about the size of this room, and all 500 Yupiks were eating with their spoons. Now, what does that tell you about these people, all 500 real people in the room? They knew that their guest would eat his agudak with a spoon. They knew he would have no clue that in their tradition it was eaten with fingers. And so rather than make their one guest feel out of place, they all shifted to his way of doing things. That's community. What can we learn from that? How many times we get stubborn about our customs and say, "But that's the way we do it here." Yeah, it is the way we do it here, and that's not the question. How can we make our guest feel comfortable, not out of place? How can we do it in such a way as to make them feel more welcome, and in a way they won't even notice that we did it? Eskimos wouldn't have to go to school into a missiological discussion about this. Obviously, they do this quite naturally without being kicked in the shin. Only I needed the nudge from under the table. This is what relationships are in traditional culture. So the missionary comes to talk about relationships, about names, about sharing, about mutual support, about community. And you find that the community knows more about these things than the missionary does. There's another sense in which the church comes to offer something, and those who receive the message already understand it in some ways better than we. There's the whole position of water, for example, in our tradition. Probably nobody else makes so much of the water at baptism as we do in the Orthodox tradition. More than half the baptismal rite is actually the great blessing of water. We spend a lot of time, not so much changing what is in the font, but changing the way we see what is in the font. That's really the point of those prayers. To bless the water is to change our way of understanding water. And then at Epiphany every year, Father Peter and I can talk about Epiphany in Addis Ababa, procession with 6 million people for the great blessing of water. And by the way, we both saw this, the patriarch doesn't come with a little container of water held by an altar boy and a brush. No. outside of Addis Ababa, they have a pool about the size of this linoleum area, cruciform, and they bless that. And at the far end, there's a fountain. And at the end of the great blessing of water, the subdeacons climb up there and attach garden hoses to this fountain. And I tell you, when the patriarch comes to bless, you get blessed. Hundreds of thousands of Ethiopian Orthodox pushing forward for this blessing. Dozens of Japanese cameramen fleeing in terror. But imagine what it's like to go on the river, which is for the people their highway, their livelihood, the source of their fish, and bless it in January. To cut a hole in the ice in the shape of a cross and stand there at 20 below zero and read those Old Testament passages about water. The Spirit of the Lord was on the water from the creation story. The story of Jonah and the whale, the story of Elijah dousing his offering on Mount Carmel with the water, Moses floating in the Nile, all the stories of the glorious ways in which God has used water. And suddenly there in the wilderness, those stories take on a meaning I never got in seminary. I urge all priests everywhere I go, sometime during the Feast of Epiphany, to get outside and go to a river or a lake or an ocean. It gives you a completely different spiritual experience than what you get when you just take the water from the tap and fill a tub and bless it as our little thing indoors. I told my grandmother before she died about our going every year to the river or to the ocean to bless water. And she said to me, just like we used to do, as she often did. And then she surprised me. Just like we used to do in Europe was usually the end of that statement. But she said, just like we used to do when we first came to Pennsylvania. And I realized that her parish church is only 3 blocks from the Lehigh River. And I could envision, say in 1910, hundreds of Ukrainian peasants singing the tropar of the feast, going with the baptism, with the processional cross and the banners, singing all the way, the voice of the Lord upon the waters, going to the Lehigh River to bless that river. She said, yeah, but after about 10 years, we quit doing that. And you wonder why. And I have a hunch. They stopped doing it because all the non-Orthodox neighbors made fun of those kooky-yookies. Middle of January, going to the river, ice flowing down the Lehigh. What are they doing? And so, being ridiculed by their non-Orthodox neighbors, they stopped going to the river. And what happened to the river? The river got more and more dirty, more and more polluted. Nobody was there to watch it. You see, if you go every year to that river, you become spiritually responsible for that river. And when you spot in January some trash floating in it from someplace upstream, you have a moral responsibility to go upstream and find out who's doing that and make them stop, because this is your sacred river if you've been blessing it every year for dozens of years. But if you don't bless that river and someone starts polluting it, you're not even there to notice. And the river suffers. You see, once we bless it, we become responsible for it. We take that responsibility by sanctifying that water. We should have been, this is something I've learned from my Aleut and Eskimo parishioners, we should have been the founders of the modern ecological movement. Because we should have been at the Lehigh River all those 50 years and spotted the dirt and gunk being thrown in, and we should have put a stop to it. Because you can't do that to a sacred stream. And it would be a sacred stream if we went every year and took that sacred responsibility for that water. And I can't imagine anybody polluting the rivers of rural Alaska, because every one of them has an Orthodox parish along them, and sometimes as many as a dozen or two. And no one's going to throw gunk into our rivers, because we've blessed them and they're sacred to us, and we treat them with that kind of reverence. Human beings, are made out of water. Our bodies are over 90% water. A Tlingit man spoke to me about this once. He said, I live in rain country, and we could complain about the rain. Ketchikan gets 14 feet of rain a year. One of the last rainforests in the world is not in the Amazon, it's in Alaska along the Canadian border, the Tongass National Forest. We could complain about the rain. It rains here nearly every day. It's almost a constant miss or drizzle. It's not downpours. We don't have thunderstorms. But there's lots of water. And he said, I could complain about the rain, but rain is what makes the country what it is. It's what makes this rainforest a rainforest. It's what keeps this country green, so when we do get a sunny day, it's spectacularly beautiful. In Sitka, they practically closed school for sun. Many businesses close down because when you have a sunny day, you've got to take advantage of it. And it's so spectacularly beautiful on those rare sunny days. But he says, I imagine myself, this Indian friend, realizing that I'm made out of water, transformed back into the rain from which I was made. My mind is sometimes a bank of fog, and sometimes a clear reflecting pool. My eyes are puddles of water. My heart is a thunderstorm shot through with the rainwater that surges in my veins, with thunder and lightning there in the very center of my being. I'm a man made of rain. That's a perspective on water we didn't include in the great blessing. And yet it's there, and we can understand water and all that it means for us even more because Orthodoxy came to Alaska and the Alaskans respond to it. I've mentioned several times during these last few days that the Navajo, are called Dene, just like the people of the interior of Alaska, and that this is the linguistic evidence that the Navajo are simply Alaskans who couldn't hack it. They moved to the Sun Belt some years ago before. So I can tell a Navajo story and still include it within my Alaskan repertoire. Something else that I have learned from my Native Alaskan parishioners, and that's this. Sometimes we can't see things very clearly because our frame of reference is too small. We look at things too narrow and disconnected. So this story is about how people from another culture, especially Native American, can expand our ways of seeing things in ways we wouldn't have noticed. That we Orthodox missionaries didn't notice until Native Americans pointed it out to us. It was always there. They're not adding something to our faith. They're pointing out to us something that was always there that we didn't see ourselves until they pointed it out. Some Navajo students, I think, in Flagstaff at the University of Northern Arizona were in a videography class. And their assignment as their final exam was to produce their own video about anything they wanted, as long as the instructor would approve the topic. And so a group of Navajo students said they were going to do a video, 30-minute tape as their final project on Navajo weaving. Now you and I have some sense already of what a tape on Navajo rugs might be. I mean, what would you expect if you were going to watch a 30-minute film entitled Navajo rug making? You would expect things like shearing the sheep, spinning the wool into yarn and dyeing it, setting up the loom, choosing a design for the rug, and then a weaver actually producing the rug. Much to the instructor's dismay, however, when the Navajo students brought in their project, none of those things were in the movie. It started instead with a beautiful Arizona sunrise. There was a traditional Navajo family getting out of bed, washing, eating their breakfast. The boys going out and saddling their horses. For 20 minutes, they galloped across the prairie. Cacti, wildflowers, sheep, lots of sheep. Up on the mesa, a dark cloud and some rain falling on the mountaintop. Wind blowing through the grass, more sheep. Sunset, beautiful Arizona sunset over the desert. Flash. Rug half done on a loom. End of film. Navajo weaving? Navajo rugs? Nothing that the instructor expected, or you or I would have anticipated, was in the video at all. What were they saying? It took almost 2 weeks for this major breakdown in intercultural communication to be clarified. This is what it turned out. Our focus on rug was sheep, yarn, wool, dyes, loom, and granny. That's very small. What were the Navajos saying? What does it take to make a rug? Well, the sun must rise. The rain must fall. The wind must blow. The sheep must graze. The human beings must harmoniously interact with all of this. And if everything is in harmony, everything is in balance, you can get rugs out of it. Now, why do I say that's a spiritual lesson? Let's ask a different question. What does it take to celebrate the Eucharist? Priest, antimons, cantor, censer, chalice, bread, water, and wine. Let's think about that for a minute. What does it take to make the bread? Well, usually a presbytera, some gold medal flour, some yeast, and an oven. That's the narrow focus. But what does it really take to make the bread? The sun must rise. The wind must blow on some wheat field somewhere in North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, somewhere. We forget. The flour doesn't come out of the sky as white powder. It's wheat. It grows from the earth. The rain must fall. The farmer must interact with that agricultural landscape. Somebody else has to harvest it, grind it into flour. For us in Alaska, Alaska Airlines has to fly it to our Safeway. I mean, thousands of people and the whole cosmos, the earth and its fertility, the rain, the wind, the sun, all of that is required to get the flour, to make the bread, to serve the liturgy. Isn't that true about the wine as well? Somewhere here in California or New York. Nowadays, you could say Washington or Oregon too. And much to my surprise, in my home county in Pennsylvania, they are growing grapes for wine. We used to have some hunch at least where the wine came from. Now you can't tell. But the same thing. The earth must be fertile. The sun must rise. The rain must fall. Human beings must creatively interact with all of that. And if everything is in harmony, you can get wine out of it. What do we offer when we say, thine own of thine own? We are taking the whole creation and offering it back in thanksgiving to God. And we often miss the point. We think it's just these few narrow matushka in an oven and some gold medal flour and some yeast and we got the bread. Okay. No, it's the whole cosmos there. This is the Native American understanding of what we, the missionaries, came to teach them. And they say, yeah, you're right, if you want to look at it that way. But we look at it this way.